that's setting the bar nice and low for this talk, which is always a good way to start. So the point of departure I have for my project is sort of the optimistic view is that the social sciences and empirical fields could do a better job producing knowledge. The more pessimistic view, which I tend to subscribe to, is that they do a very, very bad job of producing knowledge. And somewhere in between those two poles is probably where the truth lies. And the goal of my project is sort of threefold. One is to sort of just point out where the flaws are with the way the social sciences, and I think a lot of other fields, but social sciences are my focus, how they produce knowledge, to suggest what the alternative should be and sort of propose how you go about doing it. And then sort of the law half of me is then say, how can we take these superior methods and introduce them into legal settings to get away from the dueling partisan experts? Speaking more specifically, I think the major problem the social sciences in particular have is that they use incredibly sophisticated techniques to produce individual studies and incredibly informal, almost amateurish techniques to produce syntheses of what those studies say, despite the fact that it really is from those syntheses that knowledge comes. So we're very formal with the individual, very informal with the aggregate. We certainly need to be good with the individual. We need to be much better about the aggregate. So then what we need to do, so the proposal is I think the social sciences need to adopt sort of these more, what's sort of called the evidence-based or more guideline-based syntheses that have been revolutionizing, I think, medicine and epidemiology, but haven't yet really made the move into the social sciences. So I have one paper that's making its slow, grinding way through peer review right now. It's going to be laying out here's where I think the social sciences went astray. Here's their bad philosophy of science that has led them to misprioritize rigor. And here's sort of a broad idea of sort of what the general solution has to be and sort of some of the challenges it faces. The second paper was going to be a paper saying, here's my example of what these guidelines would look like for social sciences. I since come to realize that that paper is a good 4, 5, 6 years off. So the paper's going to replace that one saying, here's why it really is just so hard. That I can take one margin of quality, take one threat to one margin of quality, and just find one solution to that, and find that it takes like 16 steps just to figure out one set of guidelines for one threat to one margin of quality, one tool to one threat to one margin of quality sort of explodes, and it's going to explode across all those branches. It's going to be this huge sort of network of issues. We have to resolve it. If we can't resolve it, that's a huge failing, but it's going to take a while. So instead of actually doing just a really bad job and sort of here's how I can do it, I simply wrote a paper saying here's why it's going to be really hard to do it. In August, I'm holding a conference, bringing together actually a bunch of epidemiologists and other people who've worked on this on the medical side and some social scientists to sort of talk about how do you do this for the social sciences. And the really big wrinkle that makes it so challenging is that there's been a lot of work done on how to do these sort of randomized controlled trials. That's sort of where almost all the work's been done. Social sciences can't use trials that often. We can in some cases, but we can't just make people poor. Or there'd be IRBs would not approve of just making people poor. So we have to rely on observational work, but that's much harder to develop guidelines for these kinds of observational studies. And then on the legal side, I'm finishing my paper now that explains how can we get these kinds of rigorous systematic reviews into legal settings to replace the dueling experts. The few people in the law have looked at this tend to be very pessimistic. I'm actually becoming increasingly optimistic. The more you look at it, the more you realize that the legal procedures really do change in response to broad epistemic changes. And the sense most lawyers have that what we have today is what's always been and what it always will be is simply historically wrong. That said, I think Paul Samuelson's right. Funeral by funeral theory advances. I think funeral by funeral, the ability to get rid of the partisan expert will advance as well. Let's be less cruel. I need a lot of judges and law professors to retire. Let's convincingly retire. Not publishing anymore, retire. And I think this will move forward. But I think this is the direction in which it will be forced ahead just because the scientization of the law has gotten to such a point that we're going to need something more than just two experts saying contradictory things to juries that lack the epistemic competence to decide what's going on. Sort of how does this tie into wisdom? As broadly speaking, wisdom, to me, again, I get a sense we're not supposed to define wisdom, but I will, is that sort of having extensive knowledge and using it well. And I think the social sciences do a bad job of producing extensive knowledge. You have lots of little facts. We don't pull them together into knowledge well. And the legal system does a particularly atrocious job of then taking what we do know and getting it before jurors or judges in any sort of competent way. I think it also touches on a lot of issues that have come up today. So the issue of time, right? In the legal setting, one of the big debates is these reviews can take a long time to produce. And bleak house aside, our general goal is to try to get cases to go as quickly as possible, more or less. Especially if you're on the plaintiff side. Defense side is slightly debatable. But that's the tension, right? We want to sort of have as wise a sense as possible within really tight time parameters where it costs you $400, $500, $800 an hour to deal with your lawyer. We want to get through this kind of quickly. How do we balance speed with accuracy and speed with wisdom? I think it kind of touches on the idea of sort of community books too, right? Or sort of community Bibles in a way. So the big set of guidelines is the Cochrane Handbook. which is sort of clinical trials, the main guideline for trials. It's almost kind of like a Bible for the clinical trials. So how do you define your community? How do you define a set of principles to guide that community? I think in the social sciences, again, that'll be tough. My sense is most biomedical research is relatively, the RCT is fairly constant, roughly speaking, but sociologists, economists, political scientists, psychologists, it's possible. Economists have a hard time talking to themselves. They have an entire journal dedicated to help one side understand the other side just in economics. Trying to find sort of, this is the Bible for social scientists, to get political scientists, sociologists, economists, and psychologists all to sign off on here's how you do an observational study. I don't think that will ever really be possible, but how do you define your community? How do you define sort of a set of, these are the rules for this community? How do you account for differing views on what that community should be? I think it also goes back to a point that John made last year at our conference about wisdom as sort of compression. I think that's one of the big problems we face now in the social sciences, is that the ability to produce empirical knowledge has exploded. When my dad got his PhD in economics in the 70s, he used punch cards to produce his paper. I have one sitting on my desk as a reminder of like, this is what it was. And to get 2 gigabytes of data in punch cards is a stack of punch cards 2.97 miles high, right? So I can put basically 3 miles of 1970s data on my keychain now. So our ability to produce empirical knowledge has exploded. And as a result, the amount out there has exploded. And the quality, the variation in quality has exploded. The good stuff has never been better. The bad stuff, I don't think it's ever been worse, because it's so easy to do. Anyone with a laptop and $800 to buy a STATA license can do empirical work. And I've seen people who clearly, literally just punch numbers into a computer, hit enter, have no idea what they're doing. So our ability to just take this exploding body of literature, collapse it down to something meaningful, and do it in a way that doesn't just sort of throw it all together, but does it in some sort of intelligent way that allows us to separate the wheat from the chaff and really have a good sense that this is what we know. And quite honestly, often it's what we don't know, and become better about embracing that whole half of the equation too, which is sort of where the future work is going, is the law doesn't like uncertainty, right? When things are uncertain, we throw it to the jury as an issue of fact, and let the jury resolve the uncertainty. Rather than adjusting our procedure to reflect the fact that sometimes if expert A says yes and expert B says no, there's nothing for the jury to decide. It could be the fact that we just don't know, and we're not comfortable doing that in the law. So I think that's the next sort of big move for this project, is trying to say, okay, how can we create a system that that's much better at sort of embracing our growing appreciation of just how much we don't know, and better gets into things we actually can say we accurately do know. And I just hit 0, so I will stop right there.